We're starting chapter 9, we're starting chapter 8 on eating disorders this week. Today what we're going to do is talk about the various eating disorders, anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating disorder, and try and make some distinctions between them. This chart tries to put prevalence rates for common disorders in perspective. And you can see that major depression is pretty common, about 6.7% prevalence rate. Specific phobias more so. And at the bottom of our chart we see the eating disorders. So binge eating disorder, about 2% of the population, bulimia 1%, and anorexia about 0.3%. And if we're looking at men as opposed to women, you see that those are much lower prevalence rates. It's hard to tell with men, but it appears at about 10 to 1 women to men. So what is anorexia? The main criteria are restriction of energy intake relative to requirements. So we're seeing a much lower body weight in the context of age, sex, development and health. Intense fear of gaining weight or becoming fat, or persistent behavior that interferes with weight, even though it is significantly low weight. Disturbance in the way one's body weight or shape is experienced. Now, these are somewhat difficult criteria to pay attention or to consider. So let's put them in some context. Frances Chan in your upper left corner was actually identified as having an eating disorder based on her significantly low body weight. I believe that she was 95 and 5'2". And she argued successfully with Yale that had done this, that the people in her family are just tiny. On Huffington Post, she noted that as a result of what Yale was pressuring her to do, she had begun eating in an unhealthy way. So, for example, eating ice cream twice a day in order to increase her body weight. The women in the middle photo are all Olympic athletes, and this is part of a really interesting series. And the links for all three of these are found in the notes part of the PowerPoint. What is normal and healthy? And obviously it depends on all sorts of other kinds of things. So this particular photographer has done a series of photographs like this. Really fascinating. And the third set of photos are of a man in 2009 and again in 2012 after his diagnosis of cancer. So what we want to be thinking, going back to our definition of anorexia, is it's not just low body weight. Some of you are probably very low body weight and without having any sort of unhealthy eating pattern. The difference is, that we need to be paying attention here is not just low body weight, but is this person healthy? What is their age and sex and development? Are they afraid of gaining weight? And is that fear interfering with weight gain? And are they perceiving their weight in a maladaptive manner? Anorexia is a dangerous disease associated with a variety of different medical complications, including loss of menses, brittle hair or nails, dry skin, problems with blood pressure, low blood pressure, hair on limbs and face, heart arrhythmias, slow bone growth, intolerance of cold, decreased body temperature, anemia, and electrolyte imbalances. and it can lead, as we'll talk in a bit, to heart attacks and death. How is anorexia different from bulimia and different from binge eating disorder, our three primary eating disorders? People with anorexia tend to be underweight and highly control their food intake, have significant body image, seeing themselves as overweight or normal relative to what they really in fact are. They tend to restrict food intake a lot, and there are two different subtypes of anorexia, one that focuses on restriction, another binge purging, but when the binges are present, they tend to be small. Bulimia, on the other hand, or most people with bulimia, tend to be normal weight, or wouldn't consider by weight that someone could be diagnosed with bulimia. They feel a lack of control over food intake, that what they're consuming is out of control. They have body image problems and really put way too much emphasis on how they look, as do people with anorexia. Their restriction tends to lead to a binge, and sometimes they may use restriction as a way of purging or controlling what's happening. Binging is prominent, as are purges. With binge eating disorder, we're seeing people who are generally overweight, and relative to people who are obese, they tend to have more mental health problems and a poorer prognosis. They, like people with bulimia, feel a lack of control over their food intake. They probably have a body image problem, but as you look at the book, it doesn't mention it in the diagnosis. And while some research talks about body image problems, it's really not well understood yet. May diet, but it's not the kind of prolonged restriction that you see in either anorexia or bulimia. Binging tends to be prominent, purges are absent. Binging tends to happen when people they're feeling out of control while eating, and they tend to eat more junk food than typical. About 25% of binges are more than 2,000 calories, and about a third are less than 600 calories, with an average of about 1459. Non-binge is about 320. So let's think about what that means in terms of size. This can of Pringles, it says 2.5 servings. That means that it's about 375 calories. So a little bit more than is average snack. So an average binge, we said, was about 1,459 calories. So an average binge would be, the 375 calories from these Pringles and these 10 oatmeal raisin cookies, so about 900 calories here, and our roasted peanuts, so these are 240 calories, so 1,515 calories. Think about Thanksgiving. Does Thanksgiving meet criteria for a binge? And what is different? Probably most of us eat a fair amount over Thanksgiving. Part of what's different is, this lack of control, and that it only occurs in a particular context, and our eating behavior makes sense within that context. With bulimia, we tend to see a negative cycle. And we're going to see a number of these negative cycles throughout the semester. So, for example, someone may feel badly and as a result begin to diet to feel better about themselves, but restrict their food intake too much, and as a result, that diet is broken, and they begin binging. They feel bad about that, and so compensate for that by vomiting or using, diuretics or exercising or restricting what they're eating in order to fear or reduce that fear, which then produces a lot of different kinds, both the binge and the purge produce a lot of different kinds of negative affect: guilt, shame, embarrassment, feelings of worthlessness, and as a result of that, begin to diet again. We talked about medical complications with anorexia. Here are medical complications for bulimia. Most people are within 10% of normal weight. Decay of dental enamel, and so sometimes a dentist will be one of the first people to identify an eating disorder. Menstrual problems, electrolyte imbalances that can lead to heart attacks and death. Terri Schiavo, I think she died in the early 2000s, but she had a stroke that seemed to be related to her history of bulimia, was in a nursing home for a number of years, and significant legal action as a result of that, trying to get her taken off life support. We talked about, or throughout the semester, we've talked about comorbid disorders. In the case of the eating disorders, when there's a lot of comorbidity, there seems to be a much poorer prognosis. So, for example, with anorexia, the restricting type of anorexia, so ANR, they're not as likely to be abusing substances, but they're twice as likely to have an obsessive compulsive disorder and 3 times as likely to have some sort of significant psychiatric problem, such as schizophrenia. The binge purge kind of anorexia, our second type, our column, twice as likely to be diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder, twice as likely to be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, and twice as likely with schizophrenia. And this is part of the reason that we're separating out the restricting and the binge purging types of anorexia, that they have somewhat different kinds of profiles. The binge purging kind seems to be related to poorer prognosis. On the other hand, bulimia, twice as likely to have a substance abuse disorder, twice as likely to have alcohol abuse, 3 times as likely to have polysubstance abuse, so abusing more than one substance. If we're thinking about problems for these two groups, you can see that both people diagnosed with bulimia and those diagnosed with anorexia are much more likely to have problems in a variety of different realms: energy, emotion, social isolation, sleep. Not so much in terms of mobility and pain. So slightly elevated, but relative to the other groups. In terms of health problems, they're much more likely to have problems with jobs and homework, and in their social life and at home, sex, interests, vacation. So pretty pervasively having problems. So what you should do now is begin observing your eating. When do you eat? What role do your thoughts have in your eating? And we'll talk more about thoughts in our third video. Think about your emotions. Remember, we talked about not feeling very good about yourself or having some negative emotions leading to some problem eating.